July 1942, Grenard Island, Scotland. The sheep never had a chance. The animals were tethered to wooden stakes driven into the rocky earth. 80 sheep in total, arranged in spaced rows at precise distances from a single central marker. Some stood 10 yards from the point. Others were at 50. The furthest were at 100 yards. Scientists in sealed protective suits watched from the shoreline below. A Royal Air Force bomber circled overhead at low altitude. The pilot had his orders. He wasn't carrying explosives. He wasn't carrying incendiaries. He was carrying something that the British government had never deployed in combat and was praying it would never have to. The bomb struck the ground and barely made a sound. No crater, no fireball. A dull metal rupture and a faint dispersing cloud that the Scottish wind took apart within seconds. The researchers recorded the time, the wind direction, and the temperature at altitude. They photographed the impact zone from a controlled distance. Then they waited. Within 72 hours, the sheep began to die, not from blast, not from fire, from anthrax. Britain had just conducted the most successful and most disturbing biological weapons test of the entire Second World War. On a Scottish island less than a mile from the mainland coast, in near total secrecy, with operational plans already drafted to scale this across the length and breadth of Germany's farmland. To understand how Britain arrived at that island in the summer of 1942, you have to understand how desperate the strategic situation actually was. Germany had overrun Western Europe in 1940 with a speed that no Allied war planning had anticipated. France fell in 6 weeks. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway were gone. The British Expeditionary Force escaped from Dunkirk, but left the vast majority of its heavy equipment on the beaches of northern France. Britain stood alone, under nightly aerial bombardment, with its supply lines under sustained pressure and genuine uncertainty at cabinet level about whether it could hold for another year. By 1941, the war at sea had reached near catastrophic proportions. German U-boats were destroying Allied merchant shipping faster than the shipyards could build replacements. In March 1941 alone, U-boats sank over 240,000 tons of Allied shipping in a single month. Food imports, fuel, and raw materials arriving in British ports were falling to levels that alarmed the government's supply planners. Rationing in Britain was tighter than at any point in the First World War. Then, in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union and opened a front that consumed lives at a rate the world had not previously witnessed. 70 divisions of the Wehrmacht moved east. The Eastern Front was generating casualty figures per month that dwarfed anything seen in the First World War, and the Soviet Union's capacity to absorb those losses while continuing to fight was genuinely uncertain to Allied planners in London. Japan entered the war in December 1941 and immediately threatened British positions across Asia and the Pacific simultaneously. Singapore fell in February 1942. Hong Kong had fallen weeks earlier. Rommel was pressing across North Africa toward Egypt. Churchill understood that Britain could not match Germany soldier for soldier across 3 separate theaters of war with its available manpower and industrial base. His military and scientific advisors were examining every option with increasing urgency. And inside a classified research establishment on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, a group of scientists had been given a specific directive: find weapons that conventional military doctrine had never seriously pursued. That establishment was Porton Down. It had functioned as a site for chemical weapons research since 1916, when it was created in response to German use of chlorine and phosgene gas on the Western Front. By 1940, its mandate had been dramatically expanded to include biological weapons under a new and separate division, operating under strict compartmentalization. Scientists working in one section of the facility routinely had no knowledge of what was happening in the adjacent building. The facility had over 300 scientific staff by 1942 and operated under direct War Office authority. The man directing the biological weapons effort was Dr. Paul Fields. He was a trained bacteriologist, a Fellow of the Royal Society, and 56 years old in 1940. He had no prior background in weapons development and did not approach the problem as a weapons engineer would. He approached it as a scientist working through a systematically framed problem. What biological agent, deliverable by air, could cause maximum disruption to an enemy nation's capacity to sustain a war economy and feed its own population? His conclusion, reached through rigorous elimination of alternatives, was Bacillus anthracis, anthrax. Anthrax had been considered theoretically as a potential weapon since the First World War, but no nation had built a viable and scalable delivery system around it. Fildes believed the engineering was achievable. Anthrax spores are extraordinarily durable compared to most biological agents. They do not require a living host to remain viable. They form dormant spores that can persist in soil for decades and reactivate when conditions are suitable. They are lethal to animals and humans through inhalation, ingestion, or skin contact, and they could be produced in sufficient quantities using laboratory technology available in the early 1940s. Fildes argued to the War Office that anthrax, delivered aerially over German agricultural regions, could kill livestock on a scale sufficient to collapse the country's food supply base. Dead cattle meant no meat, no dairy, no tallow for industrial production. It meant a Germany unable to feed its civilian population or sustain the nutritional requirements of the Wehrmacht, regardless of how much steel it was producing. The War Office approved the research program, funding was allocated, a test site was needed, remote, uninhabited, and geographically isolated from populated areas. Grunar Island, roughly a mile long, located in the Minch off the northwest coast of Scotland, was selected in early 1942. The island had no permanent population. The government acquired it under wartime emergency powers without public announcement. Residents on the nearby mainland were told only that the island was needed for the war effort. No further details were offered or given. The first test series began in the summer of 1942. A team from Portendown traveled north carrying equipment, sealed containers of anthrax spore mixture, and 80 live sheep sourced from local farms. The animals were tethered at measured intervals around the impact zone. A bomb designed to rupture on ground contact and disperse a spore-laden aerosol slurry was dropped from a modified Royal Air Force aircraft making a low-level pass. The results were immediate and fully conclusive. Sheep tethered at 10 yards died within 72 hours. Animals at 50 yards died within 5 to 7 days. Those at 100 yards, which appeared unaffected in the early days, were dead within 2 weeks. Post-mortem examinations confirmed inhalation anthrax in every case. The internal hemorrhaging patterns were consistent across all animals. The aerosol dispersal pattern matched Fildes's calculations precisely. The weapon worked exactly as designed. Subsequent test series varied the altitude of detonation, the wind conditions, and the bomb casing composition to optimize the dispersal radius. Every test confirmed the lethality. Every test increased the contamination on the island. But the problem that would define Gruinard Island for the next half-century, was not what the bomb did to the sheep. It was what the spores did to the ground once they settled. Anthrax spores penetrate soil rapidly upon deposition. They bind to mineral particles in the soil column. They are not flushed out by rainfall. They are not scattered by wind once embedded in the earth. They sit dormant, stable, and biologically capable of reactivating the moment a susceptible host arrives. Spores recovered from anthrax-contaminated soil have been demonstrated to remain viable after more than 70 years in the ground. The Portendown researchers documented this clearly. It was in their reports. They recorded it, acknowledged what it meant for the island's future, and continued the testing program. Between 1942 and 1943, multiple rounds of testing were conducted on Gruinard Island. Each series confirmed the same results: near total lethality for exposed livestock within the impact zone, wide aerosol dispersal patterns achievable even in moderate wind conditions, and irreversible contamination of the soil in the affected areas. The island was, in practical terms, being written off as a habitable environment in real time by the very researchers working there. While the tests were running in Scotland, a production question was being worked through simultaneously. A single test bomb was not a military strategy. For Operation Vegetarian, as the plan was now formally designated, the RAF needed a delivery mechanism that could be deployed at scale across entire agricultural regions of Germany. The solution that Portendown developed was both technically precise and deeply disturbing. Researchers produced pressed linseed oil cattle cake pellets, compressed feed supplement blocks of exactly the kind that British and European farmers used to provide supplementary nutrition to grazing livestock during winter months. The pellets looked completely ordinary. An animal encountering them scattered across open grassland would eat them without hesitation. Each pellet was laced with viable anthrax spores. An animal that ingested a single pellet would develop gastrointestinal anthrax within days. The mortality rate was approaching 100%. There was no treatment available to German veterinary services that could address the outbreak at scale or in time. The delivery plan called for RAF bombers to fly over Germany's primary cattle farming regions, Lower Saxony, Bavaria, the agricultural zones along the Rhine Valley, and release the pellets across grazing fields. Cattle would consume them off the ground. Infection would move through herds. German veterinary authorities, initially unable to identify the nature or source of the outbreak, would face a biological crisis accelerating beyond any containment capacity. By the time the cause was identified and countermeasures attempted, the damage to Germany's livestock base would already be irreversible. If you haven't already, drop a like. It genuinely helps this kind of research reach more people. By the spring of 1944, Britain had manufactured approximately 5 million anthrax-laced cattle cake pellets. They were packaged in containers, inventoried, and held in secure storage at operational readiness. Target zones across Germany had been identified and mapped by planners. Royal Air Force aircraft had been designated for the mission. Operation Vegetarian was not a contingency in development. It was a capability ready to execute on order. At the same moment in 1944, Allied planning for the invasion of France was in its final stages. Churchill's strategic attention was concentrated on Normandy. But behind the primary planning effort, a separate biological contingency had been quietly approved. If Germany deployed chemical weapons against Allied forces during or after the D-Day landings, Britain's response would not be limited to chemical retaliation. The specific plan involved dropping anthrax bombs, not the cattle cake pellets, but direct anti-personnel biological munitions designed for mass urban casualties, on 6 major German cities simultaneously. Churchill's chief scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, provided casualty projections based on population densities and assumed dispersal patterns. For a city of roughly 500,000 people, the estimated death toll within the first week of exposure ran to approximately 250,000. Survivors would remain in a city where the soil, infrastructure, and surrounding countryside were contaminated to a degree that would prevent rebuilding or safe habitation for a generation. Churchill received these projections in written form. By multiple documented accounts, he described the document as one of the most horrifying things he had ever been asked to read in his tenure as Prime Minister. He circulated it only to a handful of senior cabinet members. He expressed revulsion at the projections clearly and in writing. He then approved the contingency. The authorization meant that if German forces used chemical weapons during or after the Normandy landings, the RAF had standing orders to execute biological strikes on 6 German cities within days. The decision sat inside a classified file and waited for a trigger that never came. Germany did not deploy chemical weapons during the Normandy landings. The Allied advance through France moved faster than many internal projections had indicated. Germany's strategic position deteriorated rapidly through the autumn of 1944 and into early 1945 as the Red Army pushed from the east and Allied forces advanced from the west. The biological contingency was never triggered. Operation Vegetarian's 5 million pellets remained in their containers. When Germany surrendered unconditionally on the 8th of May 1945, the British government was left with practical problems it had not fully anticipated. The pellets required destruction. Incineration of 5 million biological agent-laced objects under controlled conditions was logistically demanding and technically complex. The process was supervised by port-and-down personnel, conducted without public disclosure, and completed in secrecy. Every unit had to be tracked and accounted for before destruction. The cost was significant. No public announcement was made. Grunar Island presented a problem with no similarly tidy solution. The island was sealed with shoreline fencing and official warning signs prohibiting landing. The government's public position was deliberately vague: wartime experiments, access temporarily restricted, details classified for security reasons. What was not stated was that the soil across substantial portions of the island contained anthrax spores at concentrations lethal to any grazing animal. The contamination was not confined to the surface. The spores had penetrated into the peat layers, the subsoil, and the rock crevices across the affected zones. No established decontamination method existed in 1945 that could address contamination of that depth and distribution across an entire island's terrain. The island remained sealed for 44 years. In 1981, a group identifying themselves as the Dark Harvest Commandos collected soil samples from Gruinard and deposited them at the main entrance of Porton Downs facility in Wiltshire and separately in Blackpool during the Conservative Party conference. The group issued a statement demanding that the government acknowledge what the island contained and commit to decontamination. They noted publicly that the soil they had collected and transported contained live anthrax spores, which was accurate. The action was deliberate, politically calculated, and technically illegal. The resulting media attention and public pressure made continued official silence impossible to sustain. The government confirmed for the first time that Grunar had been used for anthrax testing during the war. In 1986, a government-authorized decontamination effort began. The team sprayed 280 tons of formaldehyde solution diluted in seawater across the island's surface systematically. Contaminated topsoil was mechanically stripped and removed in the most heavily affected zones. Recovery monitoring continued over several years. The total cost ran to several million pounds. In April 1990, government scientists arrived on Gruinard with a flock of sheep. The animals were released to graze across the treated areas. They survived. The island was officially declared decontaminated and returned to the family descendants of its pre-war private owners later that year. What that declaration actually meant was more qualified than it sounded. Deep soil core samples taken in subsequent years continued to show trace anthrax contamination below the treated surface layers. The decontamination program had made Gruinard Island survivable by the standards required for public health clearance. It had not returned the soil to its pre-war condition. The island had been rendered safe for habitation. It had not been erased. The documents describing Operation Vegetarian and the full scope of the Gruinard test program remained classified until the early 1980s. When files began to be released under the 30-year rule, researchers assembled the full picture for the first time. What they found was striking, not simply because Britain had researched biological weapons. The United States ran a parallel program at Fort Detrick, Maryland, beginning in 1943, and the Soviet Union maintained a program that continued covertly through the Cold War. But because Britain had moved decisively beyond research into production and operational readiness. 5 million units manufactured, boxed, and held ready for deployment. 6 German cities target mapped for anti-personnel biological attack. Casualty projections reviewed and approved at the prime ministerial level. Paul Fildes returned to bacteriological research after the war, continued publishing academic work, and received ongoing professional recognition within the scientific community. He was awarded the CBE in 1946. His wartime contributions were known within government circles, but not publicly attributed. He died in 1971, 1 year before the Biological Weapons Convention opened for international signature. He gave no public account of his wartime work on Operation Vegetarian. The scientists who worked under him followed a similar pattern, returning to universities, research institutions, and civilian careers, carrying knowledge of what they had built without any public forum in which to discuss it. Britain signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972, joining other nations in prohibiting the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons. Britain's wartime program had officially ended decades before that point, but the physical evidence of it remained on a Scottish island, sealed off, contaminated, and visible on navigational charts for 18 years after Britain added its signature to the convention. Grenard Island is the most honest record of what the Second World War actually produced in terms of decisions made under extreme pressure. Britain's role in that conflict was genuinely significant. A country that absorbed the Blitz, held when others fell, and contributed enormously to an Allied victory that came at real cost across a decade of war. That record stands. But alongside it sits a classified archive that describes a government that manufactured 5 million biological pellets to kill German cattle, mapped German cities for anthrax strikes, and calculated civilian mortality projections that were approved at cabinet level. Both things are simultaneously and equally true. The moral weight of fighting Nazism did not prevent the development of weapons that would have constituted war crimes under every international legal framework that followed. The sheep that grazed on Grenard in April 1990 were the first animals to voluntarily cross that ground in 48 years. They moved across soil that had once proven, beyond any scientific doubt, that Britain possessed a weapon capable of ending Germany's ability to feed itself. They had no knowledge of any of it. But the scientists who watched them graze that morning certainly did. And now, finally, so do you.